So what I'm going to do today is a lecture on our chapter 8, which is movies. And so I'm going to go through the chapter, and then I'm going to show some examples and different things like that. So let's go ahead and get that going. Oh, let me go close the door real quick to my office. All right, that's just so much quieter. We'll see. My kid's pretty active, so you know how that goes. Go where all kids want. So, all right, okay. So, chapter 8, movies. It's got 5 sections: movies, the history of movies, movies and culture, issues and trends in film, and then the influence of new technology. So let's scroll on down, and the first section is like an introductory section that we're pretty used to in this book at this point. It kind of talks about what film sales were like in 2010, because that's around when this book came out. And they talk about, Avatar and different kind of websites. What's amazing is that in the past 10 years, even though this was written when the internet was around, the internet has just changed that much that even a lot of what they talk about here is like 3D centric, whereas like, we're not even that 3D centric based anymore. And so it's like relevant, but not super relevant. And then the history of the movies. Now that's actually a really good chapter. They talk about the beginnings of motion picture technology. And this really is a great area to kind of think about and look around in terms of reading and then searching. And I already did some searching here preemptively. History of how motion picture came to be is really interesting. I think that how we go from kind of still images to multiple images. The reason this was really possible wasn't so much like what you think of as the actual prints, but it was the negatives. It was the fact that cellulose was, which is what film is, like pictures even, or on negatives, and they're transparent. And so if you put light through them, you would be able to see that image theoretically. You have to use some optics to kind of make it work. So when they figured out how to make these pieces move, it really that's where we got motion picture from. But before that, there was the kinetoscope, and the kinetoscope was really interesting. Let me see if I can find a video here. Let's see. Here's a little 3-minute and 30-second video kind of talking about it. Oh yeah, here we go, kinetoscope. So what this was doing was it was taking like a cellulose style exposure and then just rotating so that you would see one image kind of come through at a time, like kind of like how you have those clickers as a kid. Like that's exactly what this was, except that was like the way. And then, like I said, they started taking and putting the film together, and you started getting this full motion. But really, the timing of the playback and everything hadn't been standardized yet. So some were like 5 frames a second, meaning you would see 5 literal frames a second, or 12 frames a second. And when we actually get into modern day, we do 24 frames a second for film. So even though that's a lower frame rate than like television, which is 30 frames a second, and those of y'all that play video games, it's like, you want 120 FPS frames per second. When you're watching film at 24 frames a second, it has a certain feel on your eyes, and that's why when people say they're shooting for film at 24 frames, even though that's not considered a high frame rate, it has an aesthetic to it that we're used to seeing movies and have for years. So as you kind of read through this, you see how the technology changes over time. One of the things that they talk about is a trip to the moon, which is also a link that I have that I'm going to provide here. And a trip to the moon was made in 1902, and it's a silent film. We didn't have audio in films until The Jazz Singer in 1927. And so these were going to be very much more like almost like what you would think of as like going to the theater and watching a play. They're going to because cameras were they needed lots of light, they needed to be positioned in a very specific way, and so the sets were kind of built around the camera setup. And you'll see here like the sets are like literally painted in our backdrops and use forced perspective to give depth, and you know, they have just all these different scenes that really lend themselves to people kind of having these like surreal experiences. I mean, I can't imagine seeing this for real when it came out. Like, I don't know what I would think. It's pretty interesting. And then people have paid homage to this in the back in the day. So, for example, Smashing Pumpkins did a music video that pays homage to this aesthetic, and so this music video was made in the 1990s. And for those that haven't heard it, you know, it does have sound. You'll notice that the aspect ratio is still very much like the original, so it's like a 4:3 rather than what we're used to, like a 16:9, like you know, really squished like widescreen. This is going to be more like a full screen, as we used to call it in the 90s. And so, you know, a lot of times, aside just from popular culture, I tell students that are in my new media classes, like, hey, you can use this aesthetic to make new pieces of work that like recognize the past. And this is a really, in my opinion, a really great example of that. So scrolling down, you'll see that they kind of go into how filmmaking kind of becomes not just an industry, but starts becoming very heavily East Coast and West Coast, and then really West Coast. The rise of the feature and Hollywood, which is what I was just referring to, and the art of the silent film. This is like where you had all kinds of different movies that were coming out. D.W. Griffith was like a world-renowned filmmaker. He made this highly highly racist film, The Birth of a Nation, which was like about the KKK. And but it also enabled all of these different kinds of made use of all these different techniques. And so it was a really interesting time, I'll put it that way. Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton down here, you'll see they were people that, when the silent film craze was happening, definitely had an aesthetic and had a very playfulness to them that met somewhere between theater and the movies, and then went beyond when they started really getting a grasp of how the scenes and sets were used. It talks about here about the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, later renamed the Motion Picture Association of America, the MPAA. You know, we know them kind of like for copyright and pirating, but they were a group that kind of came together and started making this space what it is. And then, like I said, in 1927, right here, they talk about the jazz singer, and this is this is the first film that had sound in it, and you know, a really seminal piece. Again, if I go to YouTube and type in the jazz singer, 1927. Let's see here. We can buy or rent or see a little clip. Let's watch a little clip. So again, it's gonna pretty much just have music and sound, not too much sync sound. So it's gonna be like singing and performance.
Sure took me 3 choruses, you understand? In the third chorus, I whistle. Now give it to him hard and let it go right ahead.
And so sound was actually a really weird thing that they added. Technically, like the way it worked is that there was like film, like a frame, and then on the side, what they did was they saved a little bit of that optical, of the cellulose to put like a physical optical representation of the sound signal, and they used a little light to read it, and it would oscillate it, and it would make the sound for the movie. So it went continuously next to the actual celluloid strip, and so that was like a really interesting technology at the time. And so you can actually hear like optical based music pieces, specifically Fantasia, which is a Disney film, had that. So let me type in optical film audio. They may have a picture of it if I go to images real quick. If not, I'll move on. Yeah, here we go. So that's like what it looked like. It was like literally the sound on the side. This is like a Wikipedia article, optical sound. And so literally like the picture was there, and then it would just have like the audio on the side. And this is how you would have audio. Again, see, 19 to 1926. When you're an audio geek, you tend to remember these things. And then we move into like Technicolor, you know, going from black and white to Technicolor, and then also about, you know, the rise and fall of Hollywood studios. So this is kind of more about the studios in general, and how film. We had these like epic Hollywood produced films like Citizen Kane and The Grapes of Wrath during this golden age. And I put it in quotes because we ended up having like these huge growth periods after that. It says the percentage of U.S. population that went to the cinema on average weekly, you know, just dropped heavily. But that was also because film went multi-medium. So we literally started having television. And what's really interesting is that if we were to call this going to the movies here a drop, which if we looked at it today would be probably even less, but we were to actually just say Netflix and Hulu and all the other media platforms, instead of thinking about movies being something that that we count as having gone physically to the movies, you would see that it's a really huge percentage of people that watch movies. It's just that it changed, and they talk about that in the post-World War II television, you know, presents a threat. They kind of talk about how television really kind of changed things, and it says, you know, right here it says 20th century introduced the method that would soon be adopted by nearly every Hollywood studio. Technology allowed filmmakers to squeeze a wide angle image onto conventional 35 millimeter stock. And so that's when they went from like 4:3 to like this nice wide angle, kind of give you these huge panoramic views. And that kind of, you know, they were trying to make things that would distinctly make them different. They talk about Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, Bonnie and Clyde, Dennis Hopper's Easy Rider. You know, they started having filmmakers that were coming in and really changing things up. These were people that were considered independent filmmakers that now we think of as billionaires, because what they ended up doing was just creating a whole new Hollywood system. But at the same time, the old Hollywood also stayed involved. And so it's not like what we would think of as them taking over as much as just kind of becoming part of the system. So you had people like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, who really were like independent filmmakers. If you go and read up on them, you'll see that they, you know, they worked together and made films that really were edgy and transforming. If you've never seen the movie THX, it's George Lucas, THX. There is 1138. There we go. This film is really, really interesting. If you look at who acted in it, who was involved with it, you know, not just like on screen but off screen, you'll realize that this was kind of like a seminal text of how the new Hollywood young filmmakers kind of came to be. I'm gonna check and make sure that I'm still recording. And we are. We're at 20 minutes. Okay. Cool. So then we also mentioned Stanley Kubrick. Stanley Kubrick, there we go, is in my opinion, I'm a huge Stanley Kubrick fan. He's an amazing auteur. An auteur is someone who has a series of works that you can see it's done by that person. So Alfred Hitchcock would be another person, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas. These are people that have crafted films that you definitely see reoccurring themes and aesthetics. So I'm going to provide some extra links to Stanley Kubrick. Let me go ahead and just write that in there. Because I feel like that would be something extra y'all may want to watch. Excuse me, he made this movie called 2001, and if let's see if there's a let's see if we can get the trailer for it. Normally, if I was teaching this in class, I'd literally show y'all excerpts of it, but I'm not going to do that for lecturing. 2001 Space Odyssey trailer. I have to wonder what the trailer was like. Okay, this says it's the 19. Let's see here.
Welcome to voice print identification. When you see the red light go on, would you please state in the following order your destination, your nationality, and your full name?
Moon, American, Floyd, Haywood R.
Thank you. You are cleared through voice print identification.
Thank you.
Quite frankly, we have had some very reliable intelligence reports that quite a serious epidemic has broken out into clearance.
No, there have been some conflicting views held by some of you regarding the need for complete security.
Some apparently of an unknown origin.
However, I accept the need for absolute secrecy in this.
This is in fact
I'm gonna go ahead and just pause it. One of the things you'll notice right away is that, these are just epic shots. The sets, everything is meticulous. Even like the lights, the reflections, the models, like everything is just really, really aesthetically sophisticated. And so when we go from like A Trip to the Moon to Stanley Kubrick's 2001, you see visually like how things just in about 50 years just were transformed. Well, 60 years. Were just transformed very, very rapidly in terms of aesthetic. And then you look at today, and in 2020, like Interstellar, if we type in Interstellar, Interstellar trailer, there we go. It's like they know I'm teaching a class. You see that it's gone that much further in terms of aesthetic.
Little late, Coop. Yeah, we have
So you have like very natural,
Indian surveillance drone.
earth tones literally in the farms,
What'd you do, Murph? She didn't do nothing.
action shots mixed with
You're a
CG.
well-educated man, Coop. And a trained pilot.
and an engineer.
And I'll kind of skip over to
The
the
world doesn't move.
space side.
We must reach far.
But again, like you see, like homage to 2001, like an aesthetic that just kind of goes
We must
beyond
think as individuals.
what Stanley was even doing there. So film, just really started taking off and changing things. We had the blockbuster knockoffs and sequels. So the Star Wars franchise, in the 2000s we have Lord of the Rings, and then without knowing it, unbeknownst to everyone, we end up with this huge Fast and Furious blockbuster series that's just been going on and on and on. So it's amazing what film has done over the past 100 and almost 20 years now, close to 120 years. And so, the next side of the chapter kind of goes to like the culture of movies, what the representations, what are the signifiers in the actual frames that we're seeing, the stories that are being told, the themes that are being shown to us through these narrative pieces over an hour or two, 3, 4 sometimes. And then through these series, like, what do they mean? How are they affecting society? So they talk about A Birth of a Nation. They talk about the American Way, and kind of like, there were all these films that were created to kind of build culture. Like, one of the things they talk about is, the youth versus age, from counterculture to mass culture. In the 80s, I grew up in a really weird time where we were in our Cold War, and they had movies like Rambo and movies like Iron Eagle and Top Gun, and like all these very military-centric films that were like pro-America, pro-individual and collective thinking, and with an American bend to it, Red Dawn, things like that. And so, it's kind of like that shaped like your parents, probably the way your parents see things politically and worldly. Like, a lot of these films had a big impact on them. You can ask them about it. And so you'll also see, going back to the book here, they're talking about Bonnie and Clyde, and like Bonnie and Clyde have been remade over and over again. They talk about Easy Rider. You can tell that the person that's talking about this kind of lived through the 60s and 70s of film. And for us, for people that kind of were like 80s, 90s, and then for you all, 2000s, 2010s, there were films that were being made, like, instead of thinking about Bonnie and Clyde, people would probably think about a lot of the gangster films that were made. And what's crazy about our generation, about y'all's generation, is that a lot of that is shifted over to Netflix and Amazon, where you've got movies and shows that are like movies, like Narcos, for example. You've got this Central American narrative, and then you have this Mexican US, as I would call it, narrative that they go over on these shows. But they're also like movies. It's like, is it a TV show? It's a TV show and it's a movie. And then they have self-contained movies about things. So I think back in the day, we used to kind of really play up gangster movies in terms of like The Godfather. But I think in the 80s and 90s, with the way drug trades took over, and were represented like through Scarface and other films, like as a Patriot Games maybe, it's like had this Latin American bend to it, because the drug trade is huge here in America, as we're like the biggest purchasers of their drugs. And so that kind of came into film, and then film kind of replicates reality, and now reality kind of replicates film, all the way to the point that, like, we have people that are wanting to join gangs, literally here where I live in West Side San Antonio, where I'm at right now, where people are watching, videos, which would be considered like little movies, and then they want to go and replicate what these gang members are doing, just to kind of build clout and cultural capital. And so, to me, what's really interesting about movies and culture is that because we have YouTube, it's really kind of changed what we even think of as a movie. Because this is really talking about Hollywood movies, but I think that it's all become very self-referential. I don't know. Tell me what y'all think. Leave comments, like, share my lectures. That would be really funny. But yeah, American myths and traditions. So again, kind of coming back to this idea of like, A Wonderful Life. And then they talk about Star Wars and The Matrix, this emphasize individualism. Again, like that's a big part of America. Again, like they use the 60s and 70s. I would use the 80s and 90s because that's when I grew up. So like even like Independence Day, or for the 2000s, I would probably go with, what's a really good, well, like any film that Arnold Schwarzenegger is in tends to show some kind of individualism. But anyways, let me check one more time. I think we should be good. Yeah, we're at, whoops. Whoa, Joey. Okay, I moved the desk a little bit. We're cool. Everybody's fine. I'm actually gonna move it back. There we go. All right. Sorry about that. Then they talk about social issues, Bowling for Columbine, and kind of, this documentary / real films that are made that, you know, are very reflective of society. And I just covered that, so I'm not going to hit on that too hard. And then we get to issues and trends in films. So they talk about the influence of Hollywood in the movie industry today. Publicity and products are two sides of the same coin. Even films that get a lousy critical reception can do extremely well and ticket sales if their marketing campaigns manage to create enough hype. Similarly, two comparable films can produce very different results at the box office if they have been given different levels of publicity. This explains why the film What Women Want, starring Mel Gibson, brought in $33 million on its opening weekend in 2000, while a few others, The $1 Million Hotel, also starring Gibson, only brought $29,000 during its opening weekend. And what they're saying is that, like, you can have a great film, but, you know, there's a lot more that goes to it. Just like I have really great audio products here, but that doesn't mean that just because I have it, it's going to sell. It's like there's a lot of intangibles that go around it, and a lot of it is publicity. People just knowing that it exists and that it's out there. You know, we kind of forget about how we're on YouTube, and you'll see these trailers coming up. You see that The Weeknd's album just dropped, and it's being pushed to you, and you forget that people are paying money to have that pushed to you. That's very much what they're referring to here. You know, the blockbuster standard. Like I was talking about auteurs, like James Cameron, who made Titanic. You know, he also made Avatar, and he also made Terminator 2 and Terminator 1. He's an auteur. You know, he's someone that is like, but he's an auteur of the blockbuster. He makes films that just are huge. Someone that they also kind of give a hard time as an auteur, as a blockbuster filmmaker, is Michael Bay with Transformers and things like that. So where were we? We were talking about big blockbuster films, and then I started talking about how you know, there are these kind of generally two different kinds of people that are like either just really into blockbuster films and enjoy blockbuster films and know a lot about popular culture, and there's also people that like independent films and are really into kind of like the fringe, and then there's some that just span in between. I guess they're not so much two different people, but like two kind of posts, and people like kind of go in between. Like I think I said, I watch a lot of both. I'm really into independent films. I like Wes Anderson here. If you've ever seen the movie Rushmore, that's a great movie. I'll put the trailer for that up. And then we also talk. They also talk about foreign films. You know, foreign films is a really interesting idea to me, because it kind of really delineates like Hollywood and then foreign filmmaking. But I think foreign filmmaking is like way more distributed than kind of just like Hollywood or foreign films. Like there's a lot of different styles of foreign films. They talk about like France's New Wave movement, but even like the way I kind of like to think about it in this, you know, 2000s era is thinking about it in terms of like you know, where video games are designed and made and conceptualized, and how we think about, you know, do we think about foreign video games versus American video games, and even like how they're made, because you have a lot of social and cultural global practices that are happening where people are designing and making things and taking from all different types of cultures and things like that. So I would often assert that a lot of like great things that we see in American films come from foreign films. And so, you know, foreign films in general are to me, like highly influence Hollywood filmmaking, and you can look at that in Star Wars films. You can look at that in like the blockbuster films in general, and then also in independent filmmaking a lot of times. Like even movies as simple as like Marriage Story or something like that. I mean, there's the shots, the pacing, the timing, things like that are very much part of like a what we think of as independent films, which also draw heavily from foreign films. So, you know, cultural imperialism or globalization, you know, one of the things that's interesting in this chapter in terms of imperialism or globalization is that This is a very visual topic. So in film, like we really do, kind of harkening back to when I was talking about like War Games and Iron Eagle and Top Gun, like you had these films that were going out beyond our shores, and depending on how they were promoted, how they were talked about, really did change how it was perceived, and whether it was seen as like cultural imperialism, as us trying to show strength or trying to show friendship to other countries, depending on, you know, our political relationships with them, or our cultural practices. You know, it could be as simple as a movie like, I don't know, Karate Kid, and pick which version you want, Jackie Chan or the original Ralph Camacho movie. Like, you know, what does that mean in terms of cultural appropriation, and how is it seen in other countries where these films are taking practice, you know, original practices from, and Americanizing them. They also talk about the economics of films and the rising costs in big budget films. This is really interesting to me. This was really interesting to me when I was in graduate school and undergrad. But what's really interesting to me now is kind of going like, you know, they talk about, you know, consider James Cameron's Avatar, released in 2009, which cost close to $340 million, making it one of the most expensive films of all time. Where does such astronomical budget go? You know, when weighing the total cost of producing and releasing a film, about half the money goes to advertising. That's note that in the case of Avatar, the film cost $190 million to make and around $150 million to market. So why I find this all interesting is that we are in an age where we have YouTubers that are making videos like me. I mean, not like me as in the YouTuber, but me as in, this is an iPhone on a tripod and like some $20 Sony Bluetooth headphones, that are making content that are competitive with films that people watch. Like, you don't think about it, but if you watch an hour and a half of a podcast, and then you watch an hour and a half of a blockbuster film, like the cost of production is so great in terms of difference of cost, but you use the same amount of time to consume it, you know. And to me, like, that's kind of like a really interesting moment in terms of thinking about culture and movies. They talk about the big budget flop and what this does to economies. They talk about piracy. Piracy is really interesting because, you know, piracy was such a huge deal in the early 2000s and up to 2010, 2015, but it really died out when streaming took hold, because people no longer were so much as a mass looking to pirate. Now, we still have a bunch of people that are pirating on a fringe level, but people really do like the convenience of streaming and being able to just type something in, it working, not having to go, oh, let me go get that VOB file and go convert it with Handbrake and do all of these things to make their video libraries using Plex or to like watch my movies at home on my own HTPC. And yes, I just spoke a bunch of gobbledygook, but that's what that fringe kind of piracy has led to because of streaming. Because basically, in my opinion, what happened with piracy was that it was, yes, people wanted to like get things without paying, but the other problem was that we didn't have the technology to really make it just so easy for people to watch things and pay for it. When streaming came around, you paid $10, you know, for Disney Plus. It's like, well, you're not over there downloading the vault of Disney. You're just like, oh, I got the vault right here, I can watch it, you know, and keep both sides kind of happy. But that doesn't work for everything, as we know in music. That's still a pretty big problem. So anyways, that is 8.4. Now we're on to 8.5, the influence of new technology, effects of home entertainment technology. And, you know, this, to me, this was like when piracy actually started taking place, was when the VHS came out, because you would just take one VHS and the other VHS deck and you would just copy one to the other, and then you have a copy of a movie. Same thing with tapes. But that's kind of getting sidetracked. So let's go back to the effects of home entertainment technology. So what this did was it made it so that instead of having to go to the movies, remember when I was talking about how they show this like decline of people going to the movies? You know, this played a big role as well, was people were able to go and rent, go rent a movie and get their little VHS. Like I liked BMX Bandits when I was a kid, so I would like rent BMX Bandits at Sound Warehouse. And then that slowly turned to DVDs, and then see, VCR is legal, just barely. There's a whole story about that. The optical disc system. There was Laserdisc, which interesting tech nerdy side note is that laser discs actually, when I showed that optical audio track for film, like they actually used that on laser discs early on. However, they ended up switching to digital later, but like early on they were using like an analog and optical track. All right, back to normal broadcasting here. So optical discs, so they switched to DVD. DVD worked pretty well for people, and it worked pretty decently for the producers. It had copyright protection. It got broken, but again, it was like a fringe way of making copies of it that was still pretty hard. It was the internet that really made movies able to be shared heavily and with file trading systems. But again, like, Netflix was started in '99 with DVD rentals, but really what took off was, which actually took off after this was written, was the streaming. The streaming market just took off big time, and it's cool because it's like this this article is from 2010. You kind of get to see that timestamp right before things really get fully moving in an online format, where it's like literally now, if we were to write a new version of this, it would be talking about Hulu. It would be talking about, is it Crackle? And YouTube being able to rent, Amazon being up Prime, renting and watching, and all these different formats of being able to watch streamed or downloaded content. And again, like even iTunes, like iTunes had a huge movie following in terms of being able to get movies to watch on your Apple TV and things like that, and on your phone. That was like a really cool thing back in the day, was like being able to watch video on your little device. They talk about the resurgence of 3D, and we're still waiting for that to fully take hold. I love movies. I love talking about movies, as you can tell. I think this is a great chapter to look at and think about, maybe doing narrowing down on one little part and deciding if you want to that's what you want to do for your final project, because movies are something that everybody's passionate about, and there are all these different aspects, whether it's like the kinds of popcorn people eat at a movie theater versus at home, or how people, what's the most comfortable way to watch movies, what's the best way to watch a movie in terms of sound reproduction. Is it DTS? Is it Dolby Digital Atmos? Is it like, there are all these different, who has the best makeup artist, who has the best, what goes on behind the scenes that makes film great in terms of popular culture. Like, there's just all these different aspects that you can do an analysis around. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture. It's my first one. It was a little shaky. I learned a lot of stuff that will be edited out. But let me know how this is. Like, if you like it, send it to me. If you don't, let me know, and let me know what I should change. But I hope you're having a great day, and thank you so much for coming to class.